When Chechnya is mentioned in the West, many will look on blankly, unaware of this tiny republic within the Russian Federation. For others, the name conjures images of bearded Islamists with big guns fighting Russians or travelling to join the Islamic State in the Middle East. Or maybe some Westerners think of the concentration camps for homosexuals that made the news a few years ago. Others may even be reminded of the infamous Instagram account of Chechen Premier Ramzan Kadyrov that showed him doing everything from cleaning guns to petting tigers before it was banned. In Russia, Chechnya is much better known, and there are far stronger opinions regarding the country and its inhabitants. Many view Chechens as terrorists responsible for killing and kidnapping hundreds of innocent Russians, or as mafiosos making millions through organised crime. Few acknowledge the rich cultural heritage of the Chechen people or think about the violence they have been subjected to over the centuries. Djokhar Dudayev and other Chechen leaders during the 90s often referred to 300 years of struggle with the Russians. Many Chechen fighters believed they were not only fighting for their freedom and rights, but for the very existence of the Chechen people in the face of a Russian campaign to exterminate them. How have these different images of Chechnya formed? What has led to such polarised views on Chechnya, a country with a population of less than 2 million, ranked 76th of 92 federal Russian subjects in terms of size? This episode is the first part in a series examining the history of Chechnya and its tragic tale of exploitation and missed opportunities. In the first episode, we will be examining the development of the Chechen nation and the events that shaped it, particularly in the first 200 years of Chechnya's conflict with Russia. But before we get into that, we must look at the geography of Chechnya and the Caucasus mountain range in which it lies. The Caucasus Mountains can be found between the Black and Caspian Seas, and these mountains are one of the barriers between Europe and Asia, containing some of the few land routes between these continents. As such, it has long been an area of strategic importance and therefore competition. Ancient ruins of Greek, Persian, and Roman civilizations, among others, can be found across the Caucasus. Great powers competed for control over the passes through the mountains for millennia. This has made the Caucasus a melting pot of different cultures, religions, peoples, and languages. A quick look at an ethno-linguistic map of the region shows an array of different ethnic groups, with dozens of languages coming from completely different linguistic families. Medieval Arab geographers referred to the Caucasus as the Mountain of Tongues, such were the number of languages spoken in this region. There are 3 distinct indigenous language families of the Caucasus that share almost no affinity, and these families are made up of numerous separate languages that, while sharing roots, have developed in their own direction. To make matters even more complicated, the numerous invaders, settlers, and conquerors of the region often brought their own languages, leaving groups that speak languages from Indo-European, Semitic, Turkic, and Mongolic language families. This has left the North Caucasus as one of the most linguistically diverse regions on the planet. But what about Chechnya itself? Chechnya stands as one of the more homogeneous regions of the Caucasus, with the population speaking Chechen, which is one of these indigenous languages. Geographically, Chechnya consists of a strip of land starting to the south with mountain peaks, moving down valleys into the densely forested foothills, before the land flattens out to form the floodplain of the Terek River in the north of the country. Chechen civilization was largely based around fortified mountain villages known as auls. These usually consisted of a large number of housing compounds where extended families would live together. These villages varied in size and the level of fortifications, with most being limited to having a few of the iconic stone towers seen throughout the Caucasus, in which the population could hold out against small bands of attackers. Other settlements were walled, but generally speaking the communities weren't large. This lack of large settlements was likely a major reason Chechnya was able to maintain a largely democratic system without ruling kings or barons coming to dominate and control the land. Instead, Chechen villages tended to be loosely governed by councils of elders that were elected by those living there. In the Caucasus, as in many pre-modern societies, elders were highly regarded and respected. As such, age was obviously a prerequisite in leading communities, but when elections took place, those voting were also looking for those with strong diplomatic and arbitration skills. As well as dealing with outsiders, the elder councils often acted as judge and jury when dealing with internal conflict, so they were often put in the position of having to choose one side over another. This meant when electing elders, Chechens had to be careful to pick those who were held in high regard and viewed as impartial so that their decisions would be respected, even if they were unpopular. Ending conflicts through arbitration and compromise was vital for Chechens, as the alternative to peaceful solutions was the blood feud. In many societies that lack central authorities, the blood feud or an equivalent is used as a deterrent to crime. But what exactly is blood feud in the Chechen context? Blood feud allows parties to seek revenge against those that have offended them and can be passed down through generations, meaning if a Chechen's grandparents had a wrong done to them and they failed to exact appropriate revenge, the burden of taking this revenge was passed down. This burden could be passed down several generations, and those involved were expected to work hard to right the perceived wrongs of the past through violence, or through arbitration by the elders respected of both sides. An issue that could make blood feud more complicated was the Chechen clan system. Chechens themselves don't use the term clan, instead they call these bodies tapes. Tapes, much like villages, had their own elected councils of elders, so if there was a major feud between people from different tapes, it was up to the elders to try and arbitrate. However, it was unlikely that the elders would want to be seen as capitulating to another tape, making compromise harder to achieve. This meant tapes would often enter conflict with each other over small issues that could quickly escalate into tit-for-tat violence and raiding, making it even harder to come to any agreement. We've seen how tapes were led and how they interact, but who actually makes up a tape? This question has no single answer, as what constitutes a tape has evolved over time. Historically, a tape was a group that shared ownership of land, and it was not so much about family. This meant that people could join a tape by buying into the communal land. More recently, a tape has developed to be associated with shared ancestry rather than land, making tapes seem like extended families in some cases. Those within a tape were expected to support each other, not just through blood feud but in more practical ways as well. Members of a tape would try and work to ensure everyone had work and was able to provide for their family in a kind of early welfare-like system. Each tape therefore acted like a micro-state. They had governments in the elder councils, some form of welfare to support the people, but international politics and war were replaced with arbitration and blood feud between other tapes. When looked at in this way, it seems Chechnya lacked unity. Even if a population did share language and culture, there was substantial infighting between various tapes, leaving Chechnya fractured. Something that was key to reducing this early disunity was Islam. While the Caucasus in general has seen significant religious diversity as various neighbouring empires spread their own religions by osmosis or through design. To the south, Armenia and Georgia both became Christian in the early 4th centuries and influenced several groups in the Caucasus, such as the Ossetians, who remain Christian to this day. Between the 7th and 10th century, the Kazakh Khaganate to the north of the mountains had a large Jewish population. There was a substantial population of Jews living in the Caucasus, however it has recently shrunk as many have immigrated to Israel. Islam was brought into the Caucasus around the 7th century by Arabs that controlled the southeastern edge of the mountains in modern Dagestan. Islam was slow to move west and waxed and waned in influence in sync with Arab power in the region. With the collapse of the Kazakh Khaganate in the 10th century, there was less religious competition in the Caucasus. Despite this, it was not until the 14th century that Islam was able to properly spread to Chechnya. The growth of Islam was largely a result of Sufi brotherhoods proselytizing in the region. Sufism has been seen as vital to the spread of Islam in many areas on the fringes of the Islamic world. Sufi sheikhs would often take local religious practices and incorporate them into Islamic worship. Sufi brotherhoods are also often a more personal form of Islam, with those most devout becoming students, often called murids, to a sheikh. Sufism tends to lean towards religious mysticism, which involves rituals not seen in other forms of Islam, such as the zikr dances. While most people would not fully commit to entering a brotherhood and becoming a murid, they would still respect sheikhs as holy men and would even take part in some of the Sufi rites. Sufism would spread gradually, but certain events and conflicts would increase its hold on the Chechen people. We've seen some of the more important influences on Chechnya's development, the geography, the political and social structures, as well as the coming of Islam. But these must be observed in practice. We will now take a different approach and look at Chechnya's history in a more chronological way, starting with contact between Russia and Chechnya. According to much Russian and later Soviet literature, in 1781, Chechen leaders swore an oath of fealty to Empress Catherine the Great. However, as we have seen, Chechen society lacked any single leader or even group of leaders capable of making agreements on behalf of the whole Chechen people. Instead, it is likely some Chechens on the immediate fringes of the Russian Empire agreed to accept Russian authority, and this was blown out of proportion by those interested in showing Russia's power. But we must ask the question, why did Russia demand this submission in the first place? Southern expansion of the Russian Empire in the 18th century had numerous objectives, such as seeking to link with Christian kingdoms of Armenia and Georgia, gaining warm water ports on the Black Sea, and even opening trade to India and the British Empire. However, these objectives did not really require the conquest of Chechnya. Chechnya had no major passes through the mountains, and certainly no ports, Black Sea or otherwise. However, in achieving these goals, Russian borders would infringe upon Chechen lands. Those that had pushed these borders and initially started making contact with the Chechens were the Cossacks. By the 18th century, the Cossacks had become a hugely successful tool for the Russian Empire. They were partially nomadic colonists, but in exchange for semi-independence from the Russian Empire, would act as a frontier army. They would fight those on Russia's borders and settle their lands with their own fortified towns and villages. Their expansion eventually reached the Terek River plain to the north of Chechnya, and this led them into contact with the Chechen people that had previously moved down from the mountains and forests to farm the banks of the Terek. The encroachment of the Cossacks into Chechen lands led to conflict between the two groups, often small in scale and centered on raiding for portable loot such as horses and livestock, as well as hostages for ransom. This conflict was likely costing the Russians little. However, the conflict was escalated in scale when a religious leader of the Naqshbandi Sufi order, Sheikh Mansur, declared a jihad against the Christian Cossacks in 1785. The Russians would not stand for these attacks on their Cossack subjects, no matter the origin of the violence. To try and stop the Chechens, Russia sent a force to burn Mansur's village and apprehend the sheikh. While they succeeded in the former, Mansur escaped and was able to rally more fighters to ambush the Russian force, killing 600 of their men. This was to be Mansur's greatest and only significant victory before he was eventually defeated 6 years later. Despite his lack of military success, Mansur left an important legacy on Chechnya, particularly in his tradition of resistance to the Russians using Sufi orders and their organizational structures. The Naqshbandi Sufi order had been key to Mansur's movement. The spread of the order meant Naqshbandi brotherhoods could be found in many villages. Sheikhs from across Chechnya that supported Mansur would be able to send their murids to follow him and form a cadre of dedicated fighters. This was helped as a key component of Sufism as the submission of the murid to their sheikh, so when sheikhs sent their followers to fight Mansur, they were doing so under a religious obligation. While not all Chechens were involved directly in the Sufi orders, as we talked about earlier, Sufi sheikhs were often well respected by Chechens for their age and learning. So when ordinary Chechens saw them sending their own followers to fight, many were inspired to do the same. Likewise, when the sheikhs spread anti-Russian messages and ideas to the population, they were listened to. Villages where Naqshbandi brotherhoods were popular were more likely to provide greater support for the resistance, not just in terms of fighters, but also in providing shelter and provisions to Mansur's army. This meant many sheikhs from across Chechnya were also acting as recruiters and propagandists for Mansur. This provided a cross-tape network that supported fighting the Russians. These Sufi orders also worked hard to spread their own interpretation of Sharia law in an attempt to increase the cohesion in Chechen society by introducing universal laws and obligations that would make the population easier to unify and organize. While Mansur's resistance only lasted 6 years and only consisted of one major military victory, its legacy was not so much of military success. Instead, it was of the use of these Sufi brotherhoods and Sharia law to shape the Chechen people into a more cohesive nation, able to unify against foreign invaders. While Chechens had continued waging low-level attacks and taking part in small-scale raiding against the colonizing Russians and Cossacks since Mansur's defeat, things were to escalate with the appointment of General Yermolov to lead the Russians in the Caucasus. Starting in 1817, Yermolov began pushing Russian domination south towards the mountains and building a new line of fortresses to protect the newly conquered territory. Alongside this fortress building, Yermolov launched punitive expeditions into Chechen settlements to try and cow the population into accepting Russian domination by burning their houses and generally showing the might and impunity of Russian forces. Yermolov believed that a terrified population would not be willing to risk fighting back or raiding Russian settlements. His strategy can be summarized in one of his famous quotes taken from the writings of Russian military historian Vasily Poto. "I want the terror inspired by my name to defend our borders more effectively than a belt of fortresses. and my word shall be unto the natives a law even more inexorable than death itself. In the eyes of Asians, laxity is merely a sign of weakness, and it is because of my own philanthropic nature that I am mercilessly strict. A single punitive operation preserves the lives of hundreds of Russian soldiers and thousands of Muslims from treason. These methods obviously did not endear Yermolov to those he brutalized, but even in regions not directly attacked, such as Dagestan, where Russian influence was insubstantial, the shockwaves were felt. There was a mass displacement of people as Russian territory expanded behind the line of new forts. Many were made refugees by punitive expeditions that burned villages. Others simply fled, fearing they would be next to feel the fires of war. This disrupted local trade routes between the fertile plains and the mountain settlements where agriculture was limited, increasing the chances of famine. These factors meant throughout both Chechnya and Dagestan the Russians were coming to be viewed as an existential threat. This increasing anger in the region meant groups that previously had no love lost were willing to put aside differences and work together to repel the Russian invaders. Initially, new alliances were formed by weak leaders and proved surface level and short-lived. The first movement of major significance was an Islamic holy war originating in Dagestan. The movement started with the conflict between Dagestani groups around 1830. This early violence was aimed at unifying the region and bringing the numerous groups in Dagestan into war with Russia. Those that opposed fighting the Russians were eventually defeated and brought into the forces of Ghazi Muhammad, the first Dagestani imam. Ghazi Muhammad and his predecessor each led for only 2 years before being killed. These two leaders' main role in the war was setting the stage for the rise of the third imam, Shamil. It was the 25 years of war waged by Shamil that were to have the greatest impact on Chechnya's development and national conscience. Shamil has often been viewed as a state builder for his efforts in centralizing authority in Chechnya and Dagestan. He was driven from Dagestan early in his resistance, yet he found supporters in Chechnya and re-centered his resistance there. Much as he and his predecessors had done in Dagestan, Shamil reined back the autonomy of the Yals and centered his own control over the people. While the councils of elders and village assemblies remained in place, these bodies had to follow the instructions of functionaries appointed by Shamil. This change meant it was easier for Shamil to spread his ideologies and entrench Sharia law, which in turn made villages more likely to provide recruits and supplies to the resistance. Russia's war against Shamil consisted of brutal attacks, attrition and deforestation to wear down Shamil's forces and remove terrain favourable to the guerrillas. However, force alone was not enough, especially with the dismissal of Yermolov in 1827 for political reasons. The Russians realised that brutality and fear could not stop the Chechens resisting, and it had increased their anger at the empire. This led to policies mimicking Shamil's own methods of controlling areas the Russians took. Local Chechen assemblies and councils were kept, but Shamil's functionaries were replaced with Chechens that had been co-opted by the Russians. As well as local social elites being promoted by the Russians, certain Muslim clerics that Shamil had not patronised were also brought to support ending resistance in return for increased influence. This undermined Shamil's state and helped ensure areas taken by the Russians did not slip back into the rebels' grasp. This change in strategy, alongside the vast numbers of soldiers Russia was able to throw into the conflict, was met with increasing war weariness among Chechens. The Chechen population had dropped by a third over the course of the war. Shamil's own methods of control were viewed by many as being brutal as the Russians, and many felt that if they had to suffer reduced freedom, at least by siding with the Russians, they would hasten the end of the war. The end result of these efforts was Shamil became unable to replace lost fighters and had his force worn down to the point eventually he surrendered in 1859 upon being caught in the Dagestani town of Gunib. This effectively ended organised resistance to Russia in the eastern Caucasus at the time. The region was by no means made peaceful, and there was to be sporadic and even a few more substantial, if short-lived, rebellions and revolts. For now, that is where we will pause Chechnya's tale. We've looked at Chechnya's society and how it functioned in peace, but also how it was changed by war. We will return to many of the themes covered in this episode when looking at more recent events later. History often repeats itself, and Chechnya is no exception to this. In the next episode, we will cover Chechnya in the 20th century as it grappled with 2 world wars, the rise of communism, and what many view as Chechnya's darkest days during the reign of Stalin.